John. Welcome to the Post Sermon Podcast. I am Deaconess Dahlia, and with me today is Pastor Adam.
Hey, Deaconess. Merry Christmas.
That's what I was about to say. Merry Christmas. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing great. So we will be discussing your sermon from Christmas Eve, and we're going to talk a little bit about Christmas Day as well.
Yep. Double feature today.
But we're on which day of Christmas are we on right now?
I don't know. It's
Four.
Wednesday.
4, right? I don't know.
Christmas Day is first day?
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can tell it is the week after. Christmas. Yeah.
So true. So looking at your Christmas Eve service, you preached over the text Luke 2. And Luke 2 is always read each Christmas Eve, correct?
Yeah. It's it's
a Christmas story.
It's
right
the Christmas
there.
story, and it's kind of hard not to preach on that. Even though there are plenty of other readings throughout the service.
I mean, amazing readings too, right?
Yeah, I really love the First John reading, the Titus reading. It's so good. Yeah.
Yep. So what was the central teaching of your sermon?
So the sermon is really aiming towards the peace that God brings through his son, Jesus. We are in search of peace, and we have a continually difficult time of finding peace. And peace just kind of keeps slipping away. It is elusive. And instead, God comes in and he brings peace on earth through his incarnate son.
And how would you define peace? Like, what is it?
That's a good question.
Is it just that feeling that everything is good? That you're at peace with one another? You're good with the people around you? Yeah,
there's certainly the feeling tied to peace. And I think part of the gospel is not just the feeling of peace, but it's this idea of wholeness, that everything is right and put together, and it's just the way it should be. So the Hebrew word is shalom, right? And it kind of gives us some of that idea of wholeness. I think even health, if I remember right, comes with that word peace, that everything is in its good order. It's functioning as it should.
It's no longer broken.
Right, or tumultuous or tempestuous. Yeah.
It's interesting. You never really hear it described that way. And I think with that, there can definitely be feelings, but generally when we talk about peace, it seems to be more feeling oriented. But I like what you said about being put together, that health. And
I guess I was thinking of Jesus calming the storm, and so often we'll refer to like the storms of our lives and kind of allegorize it, but quite literally, you had that weather event, right? The storm on the sea, and part of Jesus' words are peace, be still, right? And the wind and the waves return to order, and it might be a visual way for us to think of peace is everything is back as it should be.
And I mean, going with that example, and other times that Jesus mentioned peace, I mean, he is the embodiment of peace as well.
Mm-hmm. And at his resurrection, right? The words out of his mouth to his disciples in John 20.
Peace be with you.
Peace be with you. And then, my peace I give to you. So
not as the world gives, which kind of goes to the examples that you gave.
Yes.
I'd say are more, that elusive peace that does not last. Can you talk a little bit about some of those examples?
I went through a variety of examples in the Christmas Eve sermon to deal with this reality that peace seems so elusive, because we are in search for it. We want things as they should be. We want order in our lives. We want the removal of storm and chaos. And so even just something as simple as, the man finds the photo of that family picture, and he knows that while this picture looks like a peaceful picture, it's not, because he remembers what that gathering of the family was like. You have the girl that's dealing with her family back home, and then she goes to her phone to find some peace, and all that comes up like on her Instagram feed is, curated videos of violence. You have the children, you have the 8th graders that go to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, right? They're on a class trip, and yet while it's, beautiful grounds, beautiful memorial, it was a battlefield at one point. And it's a reminder how peace can be so elusive. And then we had some kind of rapid fire examples of you're in a church, and I just kind of worked through, you had a guy that's worrying about the project at work. If I just get that done, I'll be all caught up, he feels. You get the woman who's worried about her car being broken down, and can she just stay out of a repair shop, and just, how that is occupying her time and her stress. You have the guy that remembered something he needed to do, and by doing that, he forgot another thing that he needed to do, and just being so caught up in busyness and all the to-dos, and just not feeling like he's in control of anything. And then finally had a more elderly member who keeps thinking that her life's not any more peaceful than it was last year, that her life's not getting any better. And in contrast to all that, you have the words "glory to God in the highest and peace on earth," right, being read from up front, and just the jarring contrast that's there.
I love that you used examples that maybe are more of those everyday problems that maybe aren't as extreme, right? But they still matter to us. They still do affect the fact that it takes away our peace, right? That it reminds us that things are not the way they should be. They're part of that chaos and that storm. And we may not always realize they are. Because like I said, we're kind of thinking of more extreme examples, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's part of your question of what do we mean by peace. It's not just simply the feeling, but there is this larger reality of peace and peacelessness, that so much of our life is not in order, and we are bombarded by that reality again and again.
And then let's go ahead, and if you want to spend another minute just talking about the last example of the priest and the tragedy that he went through. And I'd like to know where you know more about him, or where you found out about this guy.
So this is a priest who was it mid-18th century Europe. He was getting ready for Easter. His pregnant wife died in childbirth, and the child was also stillborn. And how did I hear about this? Well, I was scrolling through social media one day, probably searching for peace, deaconess, and I came across a picture of this tomb that was made. And that's where I first came across it. I don't know how long ago. It might have been like a couple years at this point. I've just been holding on to this image for a good occasion. And he has this sculptor make this tomb, this monument, and it's a profoundly beautiful confession of the gospel in the face of the haunting reality of death and the peacelessness that death brings, because it's a tomb. And so you're reminded of death. You see skulls and crossbones, etched into the stone. But the tomb also looks broken. And inside the crack, as the thing's splitting open, you see the wife and child. They're climbing out in resurrection.
It's literally this picture of peace breaking through death.
Yes.
Right? With
yes.
the resurrection.
Yeah, and I was even thinking, the words is it kind of haunting for us? And maybe it's because it can be so tough to believe that this will actually be true. That wholeness and life and health and all will be restored on the last day. And it's haunting because that's not what we see now. Our physical eyes don't see it. We believe it by faith. And yet this tomb confesses, no. This is not the end. The resurrection's yet to come.
That's really interesting. It is nearer than we think it is. And I know we've gone year after year celebrating Advent, getting ready for the birth of Christ and possibly the return of Christ, then it doesn't happen. But you are right, it seems vague. It seems like a shadow right now, but this is very much our reality, and it's coming soon. It doesn't feel that way for us.
Yeah, there's a twin reality there. That I was looking at my devotion for today, and it mentioned how each day we are a day closer to our death, which is true, and it's part of the law of the devotion. And yet, the other reality is it's a day closer to the resurrection, and that's the Christian hope, that all will be put right, that there will actually be peace on earth, and peace in a way we can't find right now. Peace that comes through the Son of Mary, the Son of God. All right, Deaconess, I think we've talked enough about the Christmas Eve sermon itself, but we're heading into a bit of a double feature today, and we are without a vicar. I looked over, there's no vicar at the microphone. So we're going to talk about the Christmas Day sermon together. And we were talking over what to do since neither of us preached it. And I think there are a couple of things we can talk about. One is the difference between preaching on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And the other is what is some behind the scenes stuff involved in working with the vicars and getting their sermons ready. Which one should we do first?
Let's start talking about the difference between preaching on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day.
All right. Well, they are very different preaching occasions.
I was going to say, yeah, the people you're preaching to may be very different.
Yeah, if you don't have a kind of a freak winter snowstorm right before a Christmas Eve service, we typically have about 500 people that attend Christmas Eve here at St. John. And then on Christmas Day, if it's not on a Sunday, 60 to 80 people.
Right.
And so just by numbers alone, it's a vastly different sort of congregation and group of hearers.
And you have to admit that maybe if there's people in town, like visitors or whatnot, they're more likely to come on a Christmas Eve service as opposed to Christmas Day, would you say?
I think culturally, Christmas Eve is the more dominant service. And I've been told by some of our older members that it used to be the other way around, that Christmas Eve used to be the lightly attended service and Christmas Day was
when did that change?
I have no clue.
That's really interesting.
I don't know.
Maybe it'll change back in our lifetimes. We'll see.
Yeah. But regardless, it's a different sort of occasion, and it's a different sort of gathering of hearers. And that's even something I was talking about with the vicar of what does it mean to be preaching on Christmas Day to that group versus on Christmas Eve? For me, for Christmas Eve, knowing that's a much larger group, it also tends to be a much more diverse group in terms of faith and belief and not belief, or folks who are regular attenders, or folks we just haven't seen for some time either, and here they are. And it's one of those moments where, of course, the gospel always needs to be absolutely clear, but in this sense, I'm preaching to a broader group of ears, I guess.
So then, since you're preaching to different people for each of the services, you when we were talking earlier, you had just mentioned that the Christmas Day sermon might be a little bit more contemplative, right?
Yeah, and this was before we had vicars and I would be on for preaching both of them. I would kind of find my Christmas Eve sermons to be a bit more kind of broad, or even just think about what I did with the sermon here. I tried to hit in just different examples of our lives, knowing that a hearer would be able to connect with any of them, and through that I can get to the peace that comes through Christ. Christmas Day, when I would preach that, it'd be kind of an interesting exploration. I might talk about, I think one year I talked about the problem of evil.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, or we can just really have this contemplative time, and what does it mean for God to become man, the mystery of the incarnation. I mean, the gospel reading is the John 1 reading, the word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, and we can just take that time to lean into it.
So you might be able to dig a little deeper into a specific theme on Christmas Day as opposed.
Right. And so the feeling of the sermons, the hearers, the type of topics I might lean into varies. And at the end of the day, the gospel's got to predominate. And so it's just interesting to have that immediate contrast between Eve and Day, and we're celebrating the same event. This is not Good Friday and Easter, it's Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, these times to rejoice.
So you are a vicarage supervisor, and you've been through, this is your third vicar that you've been working with. Can you tell us what it's like to work with the vicar on helping him prepare the sermon?
Yeah, this is a process I am continually learning in it, and I'm learning with the vicars. Every vicar is certainly different, and every preacher is different as well. And while we have some similar vocabulary or thoughts about preaching or how we talk about it, I find a lot of my initial months with the vicars of kind of getting the same vocab of how we talk about preaching, the same sort of expectations, and recognizing the different strengths and weaknesses with each vicar that they bring to the preaching event. And I'm also bringing my own preaching strengths and weaknesses and baggage as well. And so it's just, a lot of it is just trying to get on the same wavelength with our relation as preachers.
So when you're working with the vicar, do you focus on certain parts of preaching, or what exactly do you focus on?
That's a good question. So as we are getting up to speed with each other, I guess, with our terms and how we think of preaching and how we're just different preachers, right? I'm looking at different aspects of the sermon preparation and delivery throughout the year and trying to help the vicars grow in those different aspects. And so sometimes we're just working on how to better organize our sermons in terms of the structure of them or the use of just good writing skills, like, wordplay, repeated phrases, or things like that. Or how can we make the gospel more distinctly unique? We talk about how Jesus is the medicine. How is he the right medicine for that week and not just kind of a generic blasé gospel? Sometimes I work on, the delivery or the pacing. Memorizing the sermons is always a big topic. And even before all that, how do you come up with ideas to preach on? How do you, work through the inventiveness process and stuff? And so it just kind of depends on the vicar, what I'm working on at that time. But it's kind of, it's tough with preaching, and I do sympathize with the vicars because there's like 15 plates you have to spin each week for a sermon. And the only way to preach a sermon is after you deal with all those plates. And some weeks you care more about others than some.
Well, getting back to the Christmas Day sermon that you worked on with him, what were specific things that you guys talked about for that sermon?
There were two things that come to mind. One is just to get the structure better nailed down. He is dealing with an image. We forced a vicar to say, hey, you got this image for Christmas Day. He didn't get a choice. We kind of planted that flag for him, and he had to deal with it. He also has to bring in his text, so that was John 1, and then he's preaching to the hearers that are there on Christmas Day. And how do you tie those all together and weave in and out of those different parts of your sermon? And so just making sure the structure made sense and all the right transitions were in place. That was one piece. And I think the other, and this is something I'd be glad to talk about with you, Deaconess, is the problem in the sermon that vicar was dealing with. And that is the issue in the sin of pride.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up because he did talk about us like giving gifts to one another at this time of year, and kind of got into how our acts of charity can be tainted with our sin, with pride. And that's a tricky theme, I think, to bring up, because you don't want to say like no, like you're like it's a bad thing what you're doing, but at the same time kind of bringing into or helping people be more aware of their pride.
Yeah, because you're preaching to the people who showed up for Christmas Day worship. I think it's really easy to be too broad with your law with an issue like this, and you're carefully cutting through of this idea that we have our Christian acts of love that we do. I mean, we're Christians, and by virtue of our baptism, in the Spirit's indwelling in us, we carry out good works, and we do things in response to the gospel, out of love for Christ, out of God's expectation for us as creatures. And at the same time, while we have these Christian acts of love, we can very easily turn them into places of pride because we still have our sin. And so how do you get into that without being too broad with your law? And how do you make that discomfort and that pain of the law actually appropriate to your hearer, I guess?
So then the problem then being our pride, how then in Vicar's sermon was Jesus the medicine for that?
This was the fun piece of the image. As you said, as I mentioned to you, Deaconess, we just kind of gave Vicar this image way back when we were playing our Advent and Christmas stuff. And like, all right, you have this Caravaggio, just figure it out. I remember talking to you back then, like, well, it might be kind of cool to talk about the verticality of the piece, right? How the angel's like pointing downwards, and, our Lord, who for us men and for our salvation came down. And maybe that's the way, you can use the image. But Vicar was doing some research and came across some behind the scenes information about this, that there's this, who was the saint? It's not Francis. What's the other one? Lawrence, St. Lawrence. And you get this fascinating story of Lawrence, who brings the treasures of the church to this Roman government official. And it's the poor, the lame, right, the widowed. It's the broken people are the treasure. And what a cool way to get to the gospel is that Christ is the one who makes us valuable. Christ is the one who turns us into treasures. Because when we are faced with our pride, even as Christians, we are reminded of how much our sin keeps us away from God, how much our sin has lessened us as creatures. And what has Christ done? He has become human. He's become a human creature. And by his death and by his resurrection, he gives up his blood of inestimable value and turns us into treasure once more.
That's definitely a really great way to think about it, because obviously Jesus is a gift to us, right? This forgiveness of sins that he gives us. And but then to, like you said, Vicar focused on the fact that, on another aspect of this, just that we are made treasure by his blood. So that's really cool. Right. Well, this wraps up the episode for today. Thanks everyone for listening to our discussion on both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day sermons and just the art of preaching in general. In case you missed the 2 sermons, or you'd like to listen to them again, the link to the sermons in the show notes, and you can also find them on our church website, stjohndublin.org. If you'd like to submit a question about a sermon, please email us at podcast@stjohndublin.org. And thank you, Pastor, for joining me and for feeding us the word this week.
Thanks, Deaconess. And maybe just kind of a heads up for our listeners, this coming Sunday, we have the shortest of all gospel readings coming up. And
that's right.
Yeah, so it'll be fun to hear that. I don't think you can cut it any shorter. And part of our process with the vicars as well is we're going to hear a bit more from Vicar Allen. And that is, he's going to be preaching for a few weeks in a row, and that's just part of I think is a good part of the vicarage process of Sunday's always coming, and to have that feeling of you need to be ready, you need to be prepping sermons in the midst of all the other ministry stuff. So it'll be fun to hear from Vicar and continue to grow with him over the year.
Very good. All right. Take care, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.